everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today.
Oh.
That's right, because today we are continuing our buddy read discussion of the First Law Trilogy. Today's book is Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie, Book 2.
Yeah, we should always forgive our enemies, but not before they are hanged, Charles. And we learned a lot of lessons about that in Before They Are Hanged. I am really excited to get into this. Any longtime listeners, longtime friends, as we like to say, who have been tuning in know that I'm a huge Joe Abercrombie fan. You and I are rereading this series now, and I think you've always loved Abercrombie's work, but from what I've been gathering so far, you're loving it even more on the reread than you did the first time around.
Yes, I think I've come to, I just have enjoying a lot more of Abercrombie's writing style and watching him set things up and take things down and build things up and all of his writing style. So I'm enjoying that part of it a lot, knowing where it goes. So when they drop lines or moments, I'm like, oh, I get it. It's funny. And so you that happens quite frequently. And I think Before They're Hanged, which first of all is probably my favorite of the titles and the quotes used of the trilogy. It's a great quote, and it's also I enjoy it quite a bit more than The Blade itself, although I love both of them. I think The Blade itself is a great introduction to all these characters, but Before They're Hanged gets so, some of the scenes that happen in this are so wild, and I just loved watching it all go down.
Right. There's a lot more plot going on in Before They're Hanged than there was in The Blade itself. And when you write as compelling characters as Joe Abercrombie, you can get away with a more character-focused book like The Blade itself, where I think I mentioned to you years ago, Charles, when we were first reading these, if you looked at a Wikipedia summary of what happens in The Blade itself, you probably wouldn't think it's a very good book, but that Wikipedia summary would not have the voice of Joe Abercrombie or really give you what's so great about The Blade itself, which is those characters. Now, Before They're Hanged is kind of that next step where it's okay, you see what these characters are like. I've set everything up about them in the previous book. Now, what happens when I put them into these plot events that are pretty epic at times?
That's right. And also when I put them together and force these guys to hang out, and how can I play with that through the change of POV? It's quite a fun story. And then also it's the middle book, right? If you think of like Star Wars, it's the Empire Strikes Back of this trilogy, where it's the end is kind of this
well, let's give a heads up that we will, as we normally do in our buddy read discussions, there will be spoilers through the books that we've read in that series. So here that means there will be spoilers here for The Blade itself and Before They're Hanged by Joe Abercrombie. So if you haven't yet read The Blade itself, or I'll say and Before They Are Hanged, then now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones before Charles tells you exactly what kind of ending we get.
Yes, but just know that it's good and you should read it.
Yes.
And thanks for listening.
Yes, if that wasn't clear to this point, it's good. And yes, thank you for listening. And come back when you've read these books. They're so great.
They are great. And you know what, Dylan? When you got a task to do, it's best to just get on with
Better
it.
to do it than live with the fear of it, Charles. So let's not live with the fear of it.
That's right. Would you like to take us into our first discussion about Before They're Hanged by Joe Abercrombie?
It would be my honor, my good friend.
Let's do it.
So we pretty much split this up into three separate storylines
Mhm.
here that we'll take one by one. There's the story up north, really, which is Dogman West and the rest of the gang up there, the Northmen, of course, Polder and Croy, who could forget them.
And Lord Marshal Burr.
Don't forget Lord Marshal Burr and that indigestion.
Yeah.
So then, parallel to that, we've got Glokta kind of doing his own thing in Dagaska, and then he does come back to Adjua toward the latter end of that. But pretty much Glokta just has this whole book, his own storyline that doesn't overlap too much with any of the other characters, and then we'll get into discussing the Fellowship of the Seed, as I've come to call them.
I love that title.
Thank you. Yes, so that's Giselle, Baez, Logan, Pharaoh, and of course Brother Longfoot and his many talents are along for the ride, as well as Malchus Quai.
That's right. Cannot forget Malachus Quai. So let's talk about Up North because this is some of my favorite moments in this whole book.
Yeah, I mean, I said last time that maybe we did the Dogman a little bit dirty and not talking about him as much, but he actually gets the chance. You mentioned this too, I think. He gets a chance to shine more, I would say, and Before They're Hanged. If I'm correct, he has the first chapter and the last chapter as his point of
Yes.
view,
Yes.
which is. I mean, if that were the first book in the series rather than the second book, we'd be like, oh, this Dogman guy must be the main character.
Right. And he does take quite a prominent role, and he's got the main perspective of what's going on up north. Like Wes is a POV character as well, but it's interesting to see how Dogman kind of represents the whole northern situation because none of the other characters are up there.
Yeah. So Dogman, other than West, of course, like you mentioned, the Dogman I've always felt kind of gives you a glimpse into what war is like in a way that's very Abercrombian. I mean, war and battles and fighting, right? He's always like, he's got to take a piss before every fight he gets into. And then there's all this kind of like, oh, I forgot what the signal was. I think that I don't know how much that happens in the Before They're Hanged, but we start with him, and he is. They kind of stumble upon these bodies, and then we've got Bethod just storming south, right? Like Bethod has already done a ton of damage in his first attack, and we get to hear kind of the Dogman's reaction to these things and all that. How did you feel about the Dogman's perspective in this book?
I enjoyed it. I always liked the Dogman for a northern, like what we think of like the people from the north, the Logan Nine Fingers and all that. It almost goes stereotypical barbarian, but what we get from the Dogman is he's kind of barbarian, but he's also like a sensitive guy and a thoughtful guy. And he's trying to get along with everybody. He's more of that scout role. And I think he really helps to round out this idea of what the North is like. Because almost every other character, including even Logan, fits this very much like barbarian warrior trope. And it's good to see through the perspective of Dogman instead of any of these other northern characters, because he does seem to be the most thoughtful, and that was just I thought a great diversity of thought to come from the north, is to get Dogman's perspective.
Right. Yeah, so here's something interesting I noticed up north was the parallels between Dogman's story and kind of where he fits into things with the people around him, and West, who's
Yes.
kind of so Dogman is a little bit more of this like I don't know if neutral's the right word for it, but easygoing, a little more like let's get along, and a little bit more. He has his opinions, but he's able to smooth things over, especially between we've got Tolduru Thunderhead and Black Dow, who are always at each other's throats, right? Those
Mm.
two cannot get along. And then toward the top, we've got Rudd Three Trees, who's kind of, they call him the old boy. He's this veteran who is like very competent, knows what he's doing, and also like he's a lot more level headed and sees things, but he's in more of a leadership role at the start than is the dog man. And then we've got West, who's kind of got the union equivalent of like two people who are really at each other's throats in Croy and Polder, who just are going at each other. They're more shaped as like incompetent and kind of played for being silly in the way that they're at each other's throats, where Black Dow and Tolduru are both very competent and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
And then at the top, we have Lord Marshal Burr as kind of the Rudd Three Trees of that crew.
Sure.
And he's the leader and the one that is competent and able to find a way to manage those two big personalities.
Sure. And to expand on that, you have the dog man who, amongst these northern, like, the fact better phrase, barbarian-esque, where they're all ruthless, like Black Dow and Thunderhead, and he's maybe the more sensitive guy in this sea of barbaric type people. Wes has these violent, barbaric rage qualities to him in the perceived more civilized like army. So if you think about it, they're almost like they're both kind of fish out of water a little bit, where Wes is containing his rage and Dogman is like dealing with his sympathy, I guess. And they're both trying to lead people like out of this water kind of situation. So that's was also to read those two side by side and how they're dealing with these leadership roles when they're exact opposites in terms of their tendencies and the nature of their environment. You know, it's very interesting.
Right. It's super interesting. And we end up in this position where West is kind of in charge of the Northmen, but not really, like technically by the way the Union sees it, but not really.
He's like the Union delegate to the Northerners, to the Northern Army here.
Yeah. And it's interesting. There's a big thing that Abercrombie likes to play off of is kind of that the Northmen are seen as being more barbaric or less civilized or whatever than the Union. But if you kind of step back and see what's actually being presented with those two, the Union have such a backwards way of doing things and seeing things.
Right.
And it's the Northmen who are kind of more pragmatic and frank and really just competent than the Union is here.
Right. It's a common trope in fantasy of like, oh, you're behind your walls in civilization. It's made you soft. You have weak leaders. You forget how to be out in the woods and fight battles and get your hands dirty and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting because through Abercrombie, it's almost like satirical almost, is to watch the Union kind of trip over themselves and be their own worst enemies and have bureaucracy get in the way, and the Northerners are just staring at them like not understanding what's happening. It's like, why don't they just like march right now? And they don't get it at times, and it's got this element of humor to it that keeps it really kind of fresh and interesting.
Well, Charles, speaking of someone who wants to march right now and humor, we should talk about like Ladislaw, I think. Just the way that character is pretty much the caricature of Union, not just incompetence, but growing to, I guess, what's the word for it? Complacent in the rich lifestyle that they've had.
Yeah, they're quite stagnant and they're it's pretty much the embodiment of everything that's wrong with Union. They kind of forgot where they came from, and they're just sitting comfortable and losing their priorities and squabbling, and that's kind of Prince Ladislad's personality.
Yeah, right. So the word in psych that we use sometimes is affluenza.
Oh,
which
yeah,
is,
I know.
You heard that?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's defined as a psychological malaise supposedly affecting wealthy young people, symptoms of which include a lack of motivation, feelings of guilt, and a sense of isolation. I don't know if that latter part is really what's happening to Laszlo. He's more just pampered, but it's kind of this idea that he's just so rich that it's had a negative effect on his ability to function as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And he just does not get it. He has these aspirations to be some sort of great war hero, and they're like Glocta used to be back in the day. And there's some really like funny exchanges, I think, with Ladislaw and West, where Ladislaw is like, wouldn't your like, what would your old friend Colonel Glocta have done before he died? Like, shame he's dead. And then West is like, well, first of all, he's still alive, and second, like, he got
He
himself in a
charged
real,
gallantly into
yeah,
battle and got wrecked, which is what you're proposing to
exactly,
do right now.
exactly. And then even at the end of that conversation, the chapter kind of starts with the what would Glocta do? Shame he's dead. West corrects him, and then the chapter kind of ends with like, yeah, like Glocta would probably charge. Like, shame he's dead. Like
Yeah.
Ladislaw just doesn't even listen to
Yeah.
West.
Right.
So it's interesting those exchanges, but West tries so hard to stick by Ladislaw's side, and that's something that's interesting about West's character is like he's got this side of him that's just furious, we
Yes.
should say.
Yes.
That's the name that he gets after he bites off someone's nose. Black Dow, probably the person you least want the approval of, really approves of that. And then yeah, he has that side to him, but he tries so hard, does West, to like do the dutiful thing, do the right thing. And it's interesting to watch his journey with that.
Yeah, and the fact that he has this anger problem that he's going up against alongside that he's with the most infuriating man
Yes.
possible as a crew, as like a team, as like a traveling partner, and also as his commander. He's the prince, and he's trying to use his expertise and his open mindedness and his experience to guide Ladislad, and he's just not listening, and so he's bound by duty, and his two different duties are conflicting. One is to serve the prince, and the other one is to win these battles and save the Union. So he's
Yeah.
constantly, and they're at ends with each other. And then throw in this anger problem in the mix and his splitting headaches. It's so interesting to watch him juggle. It's like, well, on one hand, if he charges, he'll kill all the soldiers. But on the other hand, he's the prince and I have to do what he says. So what am I supposed to do? And he's burdened with all this responsibility, but in the end, he can't do anything. So it's just
Yeah.
adds to the frustration. And it boils up his anger till eventually it boils over. And it's such a great, I have to say, I think Wes in this book was probably my favorite story arc of this whole book. And we'll get into it
Mm.
more as we keep going through this arc. But I have some serious thoughts on events that we're just about to get into.
Oh, yeah.
I just love reading Wes.
Right. So, long story short, with the Ladislaw tries to attack when he shouldn't have. He ends up getting a ton of people killed because of it. West saves Ladislaw. Dogmen and the crew save West, and then they're off together. Ladislaw's complaining a ton as they try to travel to warn Burr about Bethod. And for a while, Ladislaw seems more like a just like a benign nuisance is probably the way I
Yeah.
would describe him. And then West and the crew have to fight, and he's like, "Look, we have to leave the Crown Prince. Like, he'll." What West is thinking is the Crown Prince is going to be in danger if he fights with us. It's like a skirmish, a little like.
Yeah.
Uh, so then he's like, convinces Three Trees to let Laszlo go aside with Cathil, who alongside Pike were brought from the penal colony.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and she and Laszlo are left alone because West is like, Laszlo will only get in the way anyway. And then they have this big skirmish, and I think Black Dow basically like hits West and is like, use it like
Yeah.
an acting teacher or
Yeah,
something.
and this whole time too, Black Dow is like trying to encourage Wes's ang- anger, right?
Yeah.
And the more Wes is giving into that, the more Black Dow is being appreciative, and it's like you should not feel good when Black
No.
Dow is proud of what you're doing. That should be a
That's a
warning sign to you. And in those chapters leading up to this moment with Prince Ladislav, Abercrombie very deliberately often gives Black Dow the last word of like, "Oh, I knew I liked this guy," or like, "Hey, that's a good to see." It's like flipping use it. Pairing those two together is super interesting because the only thing that kind of separates them is like kind of Wes's air of I have to do what's right, So it's super interesting when Abercrombie puts those two together and how they interact and actually how they kind of get along in a lot of ways. They
Oh
have this
yeah.
understanding of each other, which should be very troubling.
Yeah, like you're saying, Charles, the last one you want the approval of in terms of seeming like a good person, which West tries to do, is Black Dow. If he's approving of what you're doing, that's terrible, terrible sign. And he's kind of the devil on West's shoulder here, and there is no angel. And I mean, unless it's just West trying himself to do the right thing, it's pretty hard when Black Dow's taking every opportunity to bring West more toward his furious side. And it is great to use the device from Abercrombie of these named men to then have Black Dow give West the name Furious.
Right. it's
Yeah.
it's definitely this warning sign, and it's but also it's kind of I was actually kind of happy. I was like, oh, good. Wes is like actually coming to terms with his like that side of himself. Maybe he can actually assert himself in the union and he actually gets stuff done. So at one part you're like, oh, you do not want to have Black Dow's favor. Black Dow's the most unsavory character there is. Like he's talking about like how like he just murders people senselessly. He's not above like sexual assault and stuff like that. Very unsavory guy. And then he's patting Wes on the back like, I knew you had it in you,
Yeah.
buddy.
That's true. And speaking of unsavory people, when West returns to where Cathil and Laszlo are left alone, he basically catches Laszlo in the middle of trying to commit sexual assault. And that's when we and West see Laszlo go from what I was saying before, seemingly this benign nuisance, to actually being a very despicable person himself. And it's interesting that West kind of has this moment where he's coming off this fury, but Abercrombie makes it very clear that West has his wherewithal and is clear-headed when he decides to basically push Laszlo off a cliff and kill him. And that's a crown prince who is would be the king if something were to happen to the king, and the king's not in good health.
Right, exactly. And it reminds me, like, because we were talking about affluenza, right? Affluenza doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. It makes you naive and ignorant, but it doesn't make you someone that's actually a horrible person. And so I think Abercrombie had this revealing moment. It reminds me of, I think it was a quote from Sanderson, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's like, how do you make a villain unlikable? You make him a pedophile. And so it's like, how do you make Ladislav unlikable? You have him cross the line. And, we saw Wes catch him in the act of trying to commit an act of sexual violence. And Ladislav's like, what's the problem here? And it's like, or he's like trying to cover it up. He's like, oh, didn't think you guys would be back so soon, whatever. And that's totally different from what we've seen from Prince Ladislav so far. Of like, we knew he was almost like a baby and incompetent and weak and all these other things. We didn't like him, but he was more like annoying. And now it's like, oh, this is actually a horrible person doing a horrible crime knowingly.
Exactly.
So that distinction at that moment, that reveal was an important one, and it brought Ladislav to the next level of unsavory, and we are cheering Wes on almost as he pushes him down the cliff.
I mean, that's that's the kind of thing that Abercrombie does with what his subversion of what we typically root for in fantasy is like the person who kills the crown prince heir to the throne. That moment is like the closest we get in a lot of Abercrombie's work to like a victory.
Yeah.
And it is a moment that if you're cheering for it, by that point, we're so fed up. Like, we're not doing justice in our relatively short podcast compared to how long it takes to read the book to how much crap West puts up with from
Yes.
Laszlo and is still supportive of him.
Tons.
And then this is just, look, before he was a nuisance, now he's despicable. And so Laszlo is out of the picture, and that changes the political situation, which we'll get into more in Glocta's arc.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So that's pretty much West, besides the stuff that happens when he's having to take over for Burr when he's out of commission. And I don't know how much there is to say on that unless
How
you
much
have
is there to say on
anything.
that? Dylan, that is my favorite scene in this whole book.
Really?
Is when he's talking with Burr, and Burr's like, damn this indigestion, we must hold the line, and then he just pukes everywhere and passes out, and Wes is standing there stunned like, what? And then he's trying to make it all work. And I just want to say about this scene that, you know, in this book, Abercrombie doesn't necessarily deliver on a lot of the plotting intentionally. And that's, you know, what makes this book brilliant.
Or he subverts a lot of the plotting.
Yes,
probably
yes.
Is better
but
than
I would
deliver.
say that this moment when Lord Marshal Burr passes out,
not Aaron Burr.
Yeah, no, not Aaron Burr. Lord Marshal.
We were
Burr.
willing to wait for it. This moment,
when he steps out and West steps out and tries to command the army, pretending he's still, you know, conscious, and how much plotting went into that moment, how much setup Abercrombie put in for that moment to pay off. Burr's been complaining of his indigestion since we first met him at the very beginning of the Blade itself, and that's amazing. You always were like, oh, damn, his indigestion, and then he just pukes black puke everywhere. It's amazing. Then you have this whole thing of having, what's their names? The two
Polder
generals.
And Croy.
Yeah, Polder and Croy. You have them on opposite ends, and you have built them up to come together. You've created the mist and all the fighting that pulled the Northerners away.
And the Shanka.
And you have the Shanka. Then you have Pike, who he rescued from a prison, defend him, being like, he's incapacitated. No one gets in. Like, Pike just has no problems buying into this setup and basically saves Wes from having Polder walk into the tent. So he's built up all of these super important, intricate details. You know, he's even, you know, had Wes, you know, encouraged by people like Black Dow to kind of do more what's necessary. All these intricate plotting moments went into this, and what's like the reveal is Bird puking everywhere. That scene took me so off guard the first time I read it, of like, what just happened? It almost felt like almost like a Pulp Fiction moment, like a Quentin Tarantino moment, kind of, when the character just all of a sudden just like blah, and then passes out, and it's like, oh man, what are we supposed to do? This just changed the whole scenario of what we thought was going on in this scene, and that I just loved that moment, and how much careful plotting and thought Abercrombie put into what is perceivably this, like, you know, here's something that happened, but it's like, here's something that was intricately laced with all of these moving pieces to come together. And it was exciting, you know. It's like, is he going to get discovered? You know, what's going to happen when they realize Burr's dead and all these other things? And then the next reveal of Burr stumbling out of the tent, like, what's wrong, everybody? Like,
that's a great moment.
It's like, I said I was fine, you know, so you're like, oh, this is so funny. And like, I don't know, I just loved that scene, and it was super exciting and funny too.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I almost had us skimming over it, but Charles, you make a great point.
I could not allow it. It's my favorite scene.
No, I'm glad you didn't, because you make a great point. I don't think I really connected all the dots you were connecting there as to, like, I guess I knew those things were taking place, but I didn't place this moment as like the culmination of all these things that
Yeah.
Abercrombie's building, and he's building more with all of those things too. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
guess
like it's
that's part
not
of why
done,
it's not
but
the moment,
no,
but
but so
it's
much
one of the
stuff
moments.
had
Yeah.
that had to all happen for this
Yes.
scene to happen. Like he had to set up like 20 different parts moving
Correct.
for this to pay off in a way
Yes,
that
and
felt
it's a
earned, which it really is. Every moment from Pike to Burr to West to Polder, like all these people,
yeah.
and to the Northerners and Bethod and the Mist. It's like these are all things that were set up beforehand that have all kind of paid
Correct.
off here, and they'll continue to pay off. But they paid off in a big way in this moment.
You're right. Yeah. I mean, things like having Pike have that moment where he's like, you've. So West basically has Pike's back, not just when he takes him out of the penal colony, but when they get separate. Well, not separated. When they end up in that situation where Laszlo loses all these troops and so many people are dead and all that kind of stuff, that when they re-arrive or arrive with Burr, West is able to say, "Oh, Pike was a sergeant
Yeah,
with all those troops
yeah, it
that
gave him a
died.
new
His whole,
identity, right?
they're all dead, but Pike's here, so why don't we have him be a sergeant of someone new?"
Yeah,
And Pike is now free. He was in a penal colony. He could have easily ended up there again, but he knows what West did for him, and he's like, "I'm your man no matter what." So the moment that Pike saves him is like very, very earned from
right. And Pike's
West.
from the penal colony, so it's easy to believe that he would buy into this. It
Yes.
speaks to his character that he would play along with West and actually like be like, "You're not getting in here," like to like a
Right.
general, and the general's like, "Well, okay, then I guess not. Bye." And then they're like, "Whoa, that was lucky." Also, Burr has been training Wes for this moment kind of indirectly at the beginning of this book, where he's like, "Those two idiots can never be in charge. They keep arguing over each other. Like, it's people like us that need to burden their like carry the burden, and I've always liked you, and this, that, and the other thing." So it's like that's all counts as setup for this too. It's like, Burr was kind of, indirectly preparing West for this moment of like taking this leadership role. So it's just all so good. I don't know.
Yeah.
So well
Well,
paid off.
that's great stuff, and I think we don't want to do the Dogman dirty again, so I want to at least bring attention to something from this whole bit with Dogman basically having to watch that fight against the Feared. He's like the only one in the crew that doesn't get involved in fighting against the Feared.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of moments that start building tension and giving us an idea of really, oh, what's going to come from this, the Feared being so powerful that even all of these named men who have been built to be extremely great warriors by Abercrombie, they're basically all trying to pile onto Fenris the Feared, and they can hardly do anything to this guy, and he actually ends up killing Rod Three Trees, which is, I just thought that moment was an epic battle, and I think sometimes we don't give Abercrombie the credit for like these plot events. We just talk about characters, but
Right.
that plot event was really cool to
Yeah.
watch.
I mean, Abercrombie, as much as we praise his characterization, I think the way he writes action is second to none as well. It's super entertaining and interesting and suspenseful, and he knows how to deal with the pieces on the board, and having Three Trees and all the other members of his crew fighting the Feared was super entertaining, and then having also the realization that the Shanka are involved and are coordinating with Bethod, and then you have the Mists, and then what comes out is this, like, we know magic has been a part of Bethod's advantages so far, because we've seen the priestess or whatever they call her, and yeah, to then now are we introduced to the Feared in this moment? Is this the first time we've seen
No,
it?
the Feared was there in Adua actually. Went to
Oh,
Adua
right.
alongside that messenger, and we see the fear through Giselle's perspective. So another moment that builds toward it, where Giselle's like, what is going on with this guy over here? And he's like, who? Does anyone want to fight me? And the guy's basically threatening the king
Yeah.
in front of all these people, but they're like, no one's going to mess with this guy.
Yeah.
So the fear that's been built toward, and of course the reputations of all these named men have been built extremely
Right.
well. And what this moment does, so the fear gets away, despite like multiple should be killing blows.
Right.
And then we're like, how is anyone going to stand a chance against this guy?
Right. Exactly. And, Abercrombie, again, does a good job of balancing the power in these fights. Like, these named men are getting good hits. And so it's like these guys did fight valiantly. It makes it feel that much more like, oh, just what a loss for these characters because they put up such an honorable fight. And then the imagery of the fear just pounding Three Trees into the dirt
Ugh.
is like so intense. And it's just, it was the best action scene of this whole book and super entertaining.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of how this ends. It's like now we have to figure out how we're going to face that guy again. It's like now there's Shenka and Magic and the Feared. It's like these are all pieces that we're going to have to deal with in the next book. It's very much that Empire ending for this arc of like, well, we just suffered a huge loss and these pieces are still ominously looming over us and we have to, keep going. And that's how this ends. And so I thought it was a brilliant wrap to this arc.
And can we speak to Red Three Trees is a great character and a character that's probably as heroic as they come in an Abercrombie book. Just a good person, of course, a killer still because it is an Abercrombie novel, but a good person who tries to do what is right at every opportunity in a really difficult world and with a lot of tough choices. And we see that so much from Three Trees. And of course, people like that aren't long for this world.
Yeah.
Here, so
I mean, Abercrombie does like to subvert his characters, and any character that shows any redeeming qualities, he likes to punish sometimes. We've seen all of this, but Three Trees kind of, got away with a clean record in such a way. Like, yes, he didn't survive in this world, but it was against an enemy that he did get death-dealing blows on. It just didn't die, So it's like, oh, Three Trees is one of the more honorable characters in this whole series, and Abercrombie let him be, which is another miracle because Abercrombie used to pretty much loves to twist some of these characters around and punish them in certain ways, but Three Trees got away, I would say. And definitely one of the most honorable characters in the series. Well represent a very valiant leader, represents the North really well, and brought all those other Northmen to his side. All they had to hear was that Three Trees was alive and leading men, and they were like, let's do this. And they did fend off that Shenka attack, and they did fend off the Feared miraculously enough. So major props to Three Trees.
Sure. And one of those people who joined up is good old Shivers, and Shivers, we'll hear a lot more of him as we continue to move through. So just want to give him a shout out because I love Shivers as a character.
Shivers joins the fray, everybody.
Yeah. And Dogman becomes chief because well, it's not going to be Dow or Thunderhead because neither would listen to each other. So
which we've seen that before.
Yeah. So, yeah, and we're kind of left with this, Burr is barely kicking, and we've got West trying to manage right now the situation with Polder and Croy, where either one of them seems more likely to take the job than anyone, and neither of them likes West. So we'll see where that ends up going in Last Argument of Kings. But I think we should talk some Glocta here, Charles. We're like 40 minutes into this episode, and it's been all up north. So,
well, those were some of my favorite scenes. So, and we, like you said, we did Dogman dirty last time. So, we gave him the time he needs. Redemption. Glocta in Dagaska. This is kind of the for the North where we get the action pieces and the the war like nature of battles and warfare and all this other stuff. Glocta, we get like political navigation and scheming and like intrigue, and we get some warfaring kind of stuff too. It's a pretty exciting arc for Glocta as well.
Yeah, this arc has always reminded me of it'd be Tyrion's
Yeah.
arc in Clash of
That's
Kings.
what I thought immediately when I was reading it the first time, because this was like at peak Game of Thrones popularity. I was reading this book and I was like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
this is like defending King's Landing. Basically, it's the same.
Yeah,
It's kind of a similar task.
exactly. So, I mean, Glocta is one of those characters. You mentioned, Charles, that bit about doing a good thing often comes around to bite you. On the FTF podcast, we sometimes say no good deed goes unpunished in some
Yes.
of these works, and I think Abercrombie's work is probably premier among
Yeah.
the works where no good deed goes unpunished.
Right.
And yeah, Glocta, he comes in and he's a torturer. He mostly does really messed up things, but he does get a moment that sticks out to me where he so he's in Dagaska. He is trying to figure out what happened to my predecessor who kind of disappeared one night. He has to try to defend Dagaska against the Gurkish, and it's pretty much an overwhelming task. And he, in all of these messed up things he's doing to try to make that happen, one good thing he does is he finds uh, this girl basically who's being tortured by the Inquisition's presence in Dagaska before
Right, because
Glocta
she
got
was the
there.
servant of the
Yes,
missing practical, the missing superior.
superior.
Right.
Yes, and she sees that she's still alive, so he's like, "Oh, we need to save her." And he saves this poor girl that seems on the verge of death, and then lets her be his servant too. And right under his nose, Charles, as he goes about all this, like, what happened to, it's like Devoost or something?
Yeah, the
Devoost is
boost.
his
Yeah.
predecessor? Or, what happened to Devoost? The whole time, it's like the one person he saved and has been right under his nose, who turns out to be an eater. So that's what we can expect from Glocta. He does something nice and
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what he gets.
yeah.
Glocta, the bleeding heart, the protector
Hmm.
of the innocent. He goes on about himself like that sarcastically, obviously, and it's almost like a self fulfilling prophecy for him. He's not surprised at all. He's like, that's what I get.
Right.
I mean, he's surprised, obviously, but he's also, he's like pretty quickly to understand it and be like, yep, pretty much what I
Yeah,
deserve.
makes enough sense. I mean, he's had such a hard life that I think Glocta is the one who is most in touch with the fact that he's in a grimdark novel. Like,
Yes.
obviously, there's no meta-ness
Yeah.
to it. Like, he's not like, I'm in a book.
Right.
But obviously, he's most in touch with this sense of, yeah, of course, like, if I do a good thing, I should probably expect that that is going to bite me in the butt.
Right,
And
and
it
he's
certainly
always
does.
kind of like, the Dagaska's surrounded. He's like, I wonder how they'll kill me. Head on a spike, body found in
Yeah.
docks. Like he's thinking about that stuff. He's like, I'd probably deserve it. I'm having all these people just killed, so many deaths because of my orders. Like he's accepting of all of it, and he has his moments where he tries to do what he perceives as a good deed and all these other things, but for the most part, he can't help but kind of watch everything in his own head and be like, yeah, this is interesting. We'll see where it goes. I may have just, sealed my own fate. He always likes to go body found floating in the docks whenever he
Yes.
does something that would make an enemy of someone else, or challenges somebody powerful.
Especially Salt.
Especially Salt, yeah.
Archlector Salt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so he's like, body found floating in the docks.
Yeah. And in those italics to know where in his internal monologue.
Or in the
I mean, he's
audiobook,
such
you
a
just hear the different accent and the
oh
way he
yeah.
kind of whispers it. It's, great stuff.
Stephen Pacey's incredible.
Yes.
So that audiobook narrator for you who don't listen, if you're going to do if you have already read these, which is I'm assuming you have if you're listening to this podcast, but you haven't listened to the audiobooks, please check those audiobooks out.
Yeah, they're really
So
good.
good. So we do get some other moments where Glocta seems to do the right thing, I guess. We have Carlot den Eider, and she's one of the traitors to Dagaska and to the Union and stuff.
Mhm.
But we find out that she's oddly enough one of the more heroic characters in here too,
Yes,
in the
she
sense
is
that,
scheming with Dagaska, but it's to prevent a battle. It's to prevent any lives lost.
yes. So her and Verms come up with this scheme. Verms is the
The
Lord
son of the
Governor's
Lord's governor,
son.
yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of, the little affluenza going on over there too. But we've got Carlot when she's being tortured or about to get tortured by Glokta. He's like, "Why did you do it?" and that kind of stuff. And she's like, "Believe it or not, like she's got nothing left to lose." She's like, "I did it because I was trying to do the right thing,"
Hmm.
and that touches Glokta somewhere because underneath it all, Charles, it does seem like Glokta tries to do the right thing, and he actually lets Eider go.
Yes, he does. That's another one of his. Um, he mocks himself for doing it, but he also can't help but do it. He's something about Ida made him sympathetic, and he's like, well, we'll see where that goes. I don't know why I'm doing this, but I'm doing it anyway. I can't help it, which is an interesting musing from Glokta. And yeah, it's I would also say another one of his heroic moments is the fact that he even sticks around in the first place. People are like, you should get in a boat and escape right now, and he's like, maybe I should, but I got to see things out here, even Archlector Salt's calling him back, and he's like, but I'm not done here, it's like we're holding out against the Gurkish and whatever. So there's also those elements of his like good deed aspect as well. He does feel responsible for the city and for like holding it and things like that. So
He tries his
he
best. I mean,
tries.
he does leave.
Yes,
So
because
let's not give
duty
him
first.
too much credit.
No, but he the fact that he even worked as hard as he did was pretty
Yeah.
good.
Yes, he tried extremely hard, and in that process, a key thing to keep track of here is he did take a giant loan from none other than the banking house of Valen and Bulk.
Mm-hmm.
So they basically say, look, we want you to hold Dagaska here, or at least try your best. We're going to help you out with this giant loan, but one day we just might come calling with a favor. And
it's like the Godfather. It's like, oh my God, it's the mafia.
yeah. So Glokta takes the loan and does a very impressive job holding Dagaska, in part because of his impressive political scheming, which we get to see some interesting stuff there. If you are a fan of sort of that Tyrion Clash of Kings storyline, I think you'd love this.
Yep.
And you've already read this, but I would guess you loved this. And the thing here that we end up getting is later on when we're back in Adua, Valen and Bulk do come knocking, but we'll get to why.
That's right. And you know what he did? Some of that money was very well spent on one of the best side characters in all of fantasy, Nikamo Casca, famed soldier of fortune.
Nailed it.
I mean, I had to segue into him because I know you have thoughts about Nikamo Casca, so I want to hear your thoughts on him.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of my favorite characters, probably one of my favorite Abercrombie characters, which is, Abercrombie writes my favorite characters. So right. Nikamo Casca, just the characterization of him when he first appears, it's like everything about Casca is like past its prime, down to his boots, down to the fact that his mustache like looks like it could be sort of like curled and primed in a way that would make him look nice, but it's not. And it's like, yeah, so the boots, it's like ridiculously fine boots, but they're in ridiculously bad shape. And it's like, I think that I was reading on Kindle, so I don't know how many pages or whatever, but on my little Kindle pages, it was like multiple Kindle pages worth of Abercrombie just telling you how like every part of Casca is like that.
Yeah.
And very clearly you get that Casca himself is very well past his prime, but he's got this great sort of roguish wit to him. Right. He's very open about these, like, I'm a mercenary and I'm going to take whatever money, wherever the money is best, that's where I'm going. Like, I don't get caught up on things like honor or anything like that. And it feels like maybe Casca came to exist because like Abercrombie needed a character that would be like money is the only thing, and you, the reader, have to be very aware that that's their thing. But then you can tell if that's how Casca started, then Abercrombie ended up having a lot more fun with him, and he's just got such funny dialogue, and his persona is unforgettable, Charles.
Right, and everyone has a story with him that goes way
Yes.
back to some like lecherous thing that he did, and it's like, well, what? I mean, that was then, eh? That was fun, right? Then they were like, that was not fun. You betrayed us or whatever.
Right.
And he's like, good times, good times. You know, like he's he doesn't take any of warfare personally. It's just like something he like does and has fun doing, and he's like, enemies, friends, they're all the same. You know, it's a really refreshing attitude, and to have him be so cavalier about it
Yeah.
it just builds up his charm.
The other interesting thing with Casca here is like Casca has his vices, especially drinking, and during peacetime, he's just laid out, drunk, nothing really doing with this guy. And then when it comes to the siege and the battle, suddenly Casca's all put together
Yeah.
and he's like the man for the hour.
Yeah, it's
And
like the exact
you
opposite
see,
of the city, you know.
yeah. So he
he
thrives in those circumstances, and I don't know. He's as side characters go. I think you said it well, Charles. I guess he's one of the best side characters in fantasy. He is way up there, and I'm not sure I can think of any better from side characters.
Well said. He also has like one of my favorite lines in that story arc. He's like, they have he's talking about the enemy, and he's like, they have the most strange and dangerous of qualities. They think they're in the right. Where it's like so true to his character of like, I never think I'm right. There is no right. It's just what side you're on and who pays the most. And when an enemy thinks they're right, it's like so strange and also dangerous because they'll forego any kind of reason to achieve what they think is the right thing to do. And when you're in the context of a city that's under siege by like this god emperor, basically, it kind of contextualizes the Gurkish a bit as well. So great line from a great character.
Right. He has lines too on honor, where he's basically like, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have this one in front of
Oh,
me.
I have it.
But
right?
he's like,
It's
oh,
like
you
the
have
what
it?
is it anyway? Right, that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Be careful with the sense.
I'm gonna
censor
it.
yourself so
I'm
we
gonna
get
censor it.
Clean rating.
Yeah, honor, eh? What the hell is that anyway? Every man thinks it's something different. You can't drink it. You can't, you know, make sweet love
Nailed
to it. The more of it you have, the less good it does you. And if you've got none at all, you don't miss it.
Nailed it.
Thank you,
Charles. So, I mean, the point is, once he's dismissed it, then he is kind of like, that is not actually a real thing.
It's kind of like a theme for this whole book also. It's like, what is honor anyway? It's no good to anybody. It's kind of like the philosophy of a lot of these character arcs.
Right. So we end up back to Glocta because, as usual, Nicomo Casca is one of those side characters that steals the show here. And he's stealing ours. So then we'll get to Glocta called back to Adua. Salt is super pumped, and Glocta thinks he's going to be a body found floating by the docks.
Yep.
But instead, Salt doesn't care that Dagaska was lost. He's just pumped that basically that Glocta was able to make Salt's political rival Morovia look like a fool by holding out as long as he did. So now Glocta seems to be in good graces with Archlector Salt.
Yes, which is always a good thing to do when Archlector Salt is your boss and a very powerful man in the Union.
Right. So then we get, shortly after his return, we get Artie back in the picture, which we're glad to see because Artie, another fantastic side character from Abercrombie. It's a shame we don't get more Artie, honestly. She's one of my favorite characters. And she's kind of in dire straits with debt, and again we kind of get Glocta helping someone out, and he takes care of Artie. He also finds out that West is missing and presumed dead, which actually seems to bother him. He's
Hmm.
got a soft spot for the Wests, does Glocta.
Yes, he does. Wests and also innocent women as well.
Hmm.
He's freed the when he freed the girl who tried to eat
Yeah,
him, and then he freed
Eider.
Eider. Thank you, and now he's coming to the rescue for Artie as well. So we see a trend there too.
Something's going on over there. We also
Something's
get to
going
see
on.
Artie unleash her own furious
Yes,
side there.
yeah, that was fun.
So yeah, she kicks the crap out of
The
the
money
debtor.
lender,
So
yeah. Hmm.
yeah, interesting stuff. We get the stuff where Glocta becomes one of two superiors of Adua, and kind of Salt playing these two against Goyle's the other one. So Glocta
Yeah,
and Goyle against each other. We then end up with another envoy, a Gurkish envoy, and this one seems like a nice dude. So what's gonna come for him, right?
right.
So this Gurkish envoy comes offering peace and empty boxes, which was an interesting little maneuver there where he's like, yeah, we want peace, we're not willing to like give you anything, but since the reason you want stuff is mostly pride anyway, we're willing to give you empty boxes that you can say are full of gold or anything like that,
Right.
so you can protect your pride over here in the Union.
Right. And, they see eye to eye. They're both very practical. They're both trying to do the right thing. And once a character's going down the right path and everything seems to be going all well and noble, you have to almost wonder what Abercrombie's going to do to what he's cooking up for these characters. And of course, duty gets in the way for Glocta, and the Prince Reynault, who was left in Adua, has been discovered eaten, and they don't care about who did it more than they care about wrapping it up quickly, even if it means stalling peace and continuing war. And Glocta realizes this, but executes the orders anyway. There's just no other option. Archlector Salt is
Salt.
very committed to wrapping things up now, and he doesn't care about who did it, and he's okay with continuing the war. And that's what we get. Glocta kind of confesses that to Artie, but that's pretty much all he can do.
Yeah, you can get the sense that Glocta feels guilty about all this, but he does it anyway because Salt would have him as a body found floating by the docks pretty quick, and you have to be realistic about
Yep.
these things,
And
Charles.
even a little bit, he doesn't. Why does he do this? He's, no. He's figuring it out. He's just coasting through sometimes and doing what he has to. And this is just the role he's played in this whole thing. And this is what the person in his role does. And he's bought
Right,
into
but
that.
he not only does he ask, why do I do this? Glocta is curious, if nothing else, really.
Mhm.
Like, the one thing that keeps him from just being focused on self preservation, besides that little bit of a moral streak he has going, is that curiosity, and he wants more answers, even if the truth doesn't have to do with who's going to get punished for the crime. Glocta wants to know who actually did the crime because the whole thing seemed too convenient.
Right.
And then when he is asking these kind of questions and wants more answers, Valen and Bulk say it's time to stop asking.
Yes.
And
Yes. And that is a very ominous interaction that kind of brings us to the end of Glocta's arc of, the war is continuing. Valentin and Bach tell me to stop investigating, and I'm kind of in trouble now. I'm like a bot man, and now we're with the interest of people that want to continue the conflict. So here we go. We'll see how that works out for me.
yeah, tough situation. He's got two ridiculously powerful folks that are telling him what to do, and disobeying either could end up being a problem. Right now, those two are telling him the same thing, so it doesn't seem to be an issue yet, but you do have to wonder where things might go in the last argument of kings for Glocta, but we'll get there in a couple weeks.
That's
So
right.
where we are now, though, Charles, is the Fellowship of the Seed.
The Fellowship of the Seed, the epic quest that takes place throughout the entirety of this epic tome of a book before they're hanged. We assemble what could potentially be seen as the dream team with Logan and Pharaoh and Baez, and then we've got some of these other characters along the way that we've come to know and love, like Jazal, and on about love, but that we're familiar with, Jazal.
Anyway.
And yeah, we've got Longfoot and Malchus Kwai as well. They're all sticking together, almost like this like oddball fellowship troop, and they're going on the classic quest to receive the seed, the mythical weapon that will help them defeat the Gurkish, and that's why everyone is on board. And yeah, but what we get out of this epic quest is not what we would expect when we've read something like maybe Lord of the Rings or something like that. You know, this is not a quest involving the One Ring. It's the seed, but things don't kind of go like we expect them to in a fantasy novel.
Well, Charles, it starts out already kind of a bizarro version of the Fellowship in the sense that we know from the Lord of the Rings, the main thing we think of in fantasy when we think of fellowships, that they already had the ridiculously dangerous, powerful item in their hands, and they were saying, how do we get rid of this thing? And that was the journey that the Fellowship was taking.
Right.
Before they are hanged, the journey that our Fellowship is taking is there's some ridiculously powerful thing that we do come to see throughout this book, basically can turn a place into the Deadlands. That's what happened to Alcus. Mm-hmm. And we're saying, well, let's go all the way over to the edge of the world to try to retrieve that ridiculously dangerous, powerful weapon. And so that's already subversion in itself. Right. And then the ultimate subversion from Abercrombie is he makes you read this whole journey, this whole quest from the Fellowship of the Seed just for nothing. Yeah. There was no seed at the end of the journey.
Yes. Yeah, it's like, what? You think just because they went on a quest that they are going to do something climactic at the end? It's like, no, it's not guaranteed just because you go on a quest. It's like these people are trying to find a weapon to use and they barely can tolerate each other. And, you know, what makes you think there would be something at the end? You know, we're obviously playing with forces that don't care about us, or are always scheming, or we're long gone, or on all these other things. So I don't know what we were expecting, but consider it subverted.
Take that, fantasy reader.
Yeah.
So, and I know, like, we love Abercrombie. I've always talked about how much I love Abercrombie, but when people get frustrated with the plotting elements of Abercrombie's books, it's because I think they feel certain promises are being made to them as readers when you set a fellowship out on a quest, and Abercrombie quite deliberately says, like, I don't owe you the end you think you're going to get from this quest.
Right.
So, but the beauty is always in the characters with Abercrombie. So let's talk a little Jazal. He got a ton of attention in our Blade Itself episode. Mm-hmm. So I think we don't want to do him dirty, but right. I think there's less to say about his journey in this than kind of the introduction of his character. We get to see him kind of learn from Logan in terms of Logan like being someone who actually has the kind of experiences that Jazal was intending to have, but had a kind of more noble, inexperienced view of what those things would be like. He gets to be humbled by being punched in the jaw. And
he was hit with a mace, right?
Sorry, yes. Hit with a mace, correct. And that wrecks his face.
As getting hit with a mace would be tend to do.
Yeah. So he learns a lot in this. I said to you, Charles, in the Blade Itself, and I think again, probably, and before they were hanged, Jazal is having the most character growth of any character so far.
Yeah, I love that he's going through these revelations, and these revelations are, hey, maybe I'm not as great as I think I am.
It's like that's obvious to
It's
everyone
like
who's
maybe I
interacted
have
with
to
you.
earn people liking who I am. It's like that's his revelation that he's having on this quest. It's like, nice job, Giselle. You really came together on that one. We're rooting for
Yeah.
you. I think where this also how these characters kind of get some development is the advantage in this arc that we have over some of these other that we have like up north or with Glokta is that we have so many POV characters here. We have Jazal and we have Logan and we have Pharaoh.
Pharaoh.
And what Abercrombie likes to do with this arc is rapidly change perspective between all three of them, and they're all interacting. So you will have just been in the thoughts of this one person, and you see how another character reacts to it and how totally opposite on the opposite pages all these characters are. And it's almost funny. It's like Logan is like, oh, there's no such thing as luck. And then it crash cut to Jazal's perspective of like, man, if only I was luckier to get out of here. It's like constantly they're all on edge and they kind of hate each other, and it's like Logan's like, oh, I'll do this nice thing for Jezal, and then you do little nice things, and that's what it takes. And then Joel's like, why is he here? He's annoying me. Go away. He's like, this ignorant buffoon is sitting next to me with his stupid grin, so it's like funny to get the juxtaposition of what the character's thinking and then how they're perceived by another character in the Fellowship, and they're so often right side by side and conflicting and funny.
Oh, very funny.
Yeah.
I mean, I was saying last episode too that I think Pharaoh gets a lot of flack as the weakest of Abercrombie's POV characters in this, and she is the weakest of Abercrombie's POV characters. And she's kind of one note to some extent with the vengeance, and I mean, obviously there's more going on, especially before they're hanged, and she actually sort of gets some sort of arc here. But her perspective, I actually really enjoyed reading this time around more than I have in past reads of this series, where just the frankness with which she conveys her view of the other characters in the Fellowship, like how she has such distaste for each other character she's with, and like sees the worst qualities that we're able to see too in people like Giselle, and doesn't try to hide it.
Yeah, she does actually kind of nail a lot of the attributes of everyone else in the Fellowship. And it's also interesting because you had said like, oh, Pharaoh, I've appreciated her more. And you had said that in the last episode. And you have read the series several times already going into this. This is my second time. And
yes.
I can agree, because I felt kind of the same way of like Pharaoh. It's like, okay, we get it. You're angry. It's like, let's go. But when you get over that and you read it again, it's like, there is some nuance going on. She is trying to come to terms with the fact that she has been angry her whole life, and now that there's people that are becoming, dare you say, friends, she doesn't know how to process it or handle it. Her relationship with Logan, she can't quite come to express that outwardly, and it just makes her even more angry. So it's interesting to see those sides of her, and then you contextualize it of like, okay, she has demon blood in her, all right, like that's part of this whole thing. So you do kind of start to see a little bit more of her character and appreciating it more in the second read. And yeah, it's like the way she like skewers Baez and Jazal and Logan, it's like, so it's kind of almost cathartic to read sometimes.
Yeah. No, I think given Pharaoh's background and how awful a life she's had, being sold into sex slavery and just terrible experiences that would horribly traumatize a person, the extent to which Pharaoh just continues to be hardened and untrusting and all these kind of things, there's stuff that we're unused to in a fantasy novel, but I think there's very true to a character who's had these kind of experiences.
Right.
And that's what Abercrombie does so well, is where in other novels we're kind of used to this, well, this person's had a really hard life, but finally someone's doing something nice for them, so then they learn to trust this person after like one or two nice things. And Pharaoh is such a true character, I
Hmm.
think, to someone who's had those experiences, in the sense that it's like Logan can do nice things to with her all day, and she's still going to have a lot of difficulty trusting anyone. And she starts to come around some, but she can't come around to the full extent during this novel that we expect if we've read a lot of fantasy. Like, people, what do you mean? Like, this was the nice event that people
Yeah.
like this person now. It's like, no, like, trust is, for someone like Pharaoh, if it can ever be earned, it's going to take a long, long time and a lot of effort.
Right. And then being able to express that outwardly is pretty much
Right.
impossible for her as well. She just doesn't know how to process those feelings. She doesn't quite know how to process communicating with people outside of surviving and killing. So you can you understand how that could be super difficult, and you're like, oh man, it's like kind of sympathetic towards Pharaoh. Like when you can start to feel that way about her, I think it really contextualizes her behaviors and her thoughts in a really honest way for someone that's gone through what she has.
Well said, Charles.
Mm-hmm.
So we also get, I mean, a lot of Pharaoh's growth, I think we can talk more about as we go through Logan's arc here,
Right.
because those two are very intertwined in more ways than one, I guess, as we go through this. So let's talk some Logan Nine Fingers if you're ready, Charles.
Oh, I'm always ready to talk some Logan Nine Fingers.
Right. So you can never have too many conversations about Logan Nine Fingers.
Yes. Yes.
Well, so Logan, something that we get in Before They're Hanged is to see Logan's leadership abilities, and I think that his leadership abilities, his capability for just developing interpersonal relationships and trust, and how he does it in a way that I think is also in Abercrombie style just so true, is like, you don't be the things that make Logan a great leader aren't the fact that he's this epic killer and all these kind of things. It's the little kindnesses, it's the humility, it's knowing what he is and what he isn't, it's knowing how to delegate, and it's showing that when push comes to shove, he's a person that you can trust, assuming he hasn't gone full bloody nine.
Right.
And he's shown that in a lot of Before They're Hanged here.
Right. I would say that another title for this Fellowship of the Seed is also going to be like the philosophy of Logan Nine Fingers, because you get so many moments of Logan kind of expounding his philosophies on teamwork and survival and fighting. He has some great lines in these arcs, basically when he's basically kind of trying to find common ground with Jazal, and he ends up kind of taking
Yeah.
Jazal under his wing a little bit, giving him
Yeah.
things about like, oh, I experienced all kinds of fear. I'll wet myself in fear before combat, and anyone who doesn't feel that is a liar and will likely wind up dead because it's an important survival tool. And Jazal's
I,
like,
I,
yeah, that's kind of right.
I do think that Logan says to Giselle, a lot of people wet themselves before battle, but
Yeah.
says about himself that he's like, I always took too easy to that,
Oh, yes.
like to
Good
battle. Like I
distinction.
was
Yeah.
not one of those people, or it
Right.
might even be, yeah, crapping themselves to keep
Yeah.
our clean rating here.
Because yeah, Logan just understands. He's lived through so much violence. He's so experienced, and just all is so new to everything that he's trying to kind of share his experiences with Jazal, and that's kind of super interesting to see, because Jazal starts out as kind of an unwilling student at first, and then in Jazal's own monologue, as the journey continues, he's like, you know what? Like, I can kind of believe some of these things that Logan's saying, and it's interesting to see.
Right. So he consults Logan. I think at first, the first time he actually like asks Logan something, it's like about fighting, and he reflects to himself like, I wouldn't have a problem asking a farmer about farming.
Yeah,
Like I could talk to a killer about fighting and
yeah,
killing. Like
right.
nothing wrong with that. It's
Yeah,
still in that pompous Giselle narcissistic voice.
right. He's not seeing him as
And
a friend or an equal or anything like
no.
that, right?
But slowly he comes around and he learns, and something that he seems to be thinking about toward the end of this, Giselle, that is, he has kind of heard Logan saying, if I were to do it all over again, I would just like settle down with someone I care about and
Leave the fighting
have
to
some.
people who are like dumber than me or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So Giselle's starting to think at this point, like, all this noble stuff that I get caught up on, that doesn't seem to matter when it's pouring and I'm chafing and I'm hungry, and
Yeah.
that's all BS. And what matters is finding someone I care about and maybe settling down with them and living a just
Yeah,
hopefully
he's like, if I never
happy
have to go
life.
through this stuff again, I'd be very happy. It's like,
Right.
this was
So
a
he's
horrible
thinking.
experience. There's nothing worth doing. We got nothing out of this. We almost died. I'm horribly injured. I suffered for months and for nothing. This was such a waste of time. And all I could think about was Artie. I just want to get back and
Mhm.
be with her. And like, this was horrible. and Abercrombie then made the quest a fruitless endeavor for the seed.
Nailed it.
And that kind of adds to it. It's like there's so much meaningless to violence and to questing and to suffering. It's like I should have just stayed home.
Right. So it's interesting from Giselle's perspective that when it does end up being a fruitless endeavor, as you say, Charles, he is kind of like, well, that actually never mattered to me, and I'm just happy that we're heading home. And he's starting to see the bright side of
Yeah,
things
he's the
in
first
a
one
way.
to kind of turn around because he's
Yeah.
kind of dragged along in the first place. He's just like, I didn't even care about this stupid seat anyway.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit more about Logan. It's hard not to start getting into how he impacts those around him because that's so much of what he does with this arc here. He's also impacting Pharaoh a lot, as we've talked about, where he's gaining her trust. I love that moment where she starts being like, I'm going to run away. And he just is kind of like, look, you stick, I'll stick.
Yeah.
Like, if it doesn't work, you can always run away later.
Yeah.
And that's a great moment, and he has those with her
Because
throughout.
Logan does have the ability to, stay realistic about these things, but also he
Of
knows his
course.
audience, right? He knows that Pharaoh is interested in survival and combat, and that's something he understands very well. And he's like, look, we stand the best chance together. You don't have to trust me, but if you're still in the fight, I'm still in the fight. And that's a language that Pharaoh understands. And it's impressive that Pharaoh's probably the most difficult person you could meet to try and work with. And he's kind of talked her down, talked her into the sticking around. And a huge accomplishment.
Well said, Charles. And eventually we end up in this situation where they run into these the whole journey is like Baez getting angry about things, taking them on taking them ways that don't seem pleasant, and we get a lot of the world being fleshed out. But at some point they run into these Shanka, and Baez uses all this magic power stuff to create a sort of like hole in the world almost.
Yeah.
And we end up in a situation where Pharaoh and Logan are together, and we get one of the most awkward sex scenes of all time. We probably can't go into and not that I'd necessarily be interested in that, go into the details of that too much on the pod, but gotta give credit to it.
I was cracking up. What's the name of the voice actor again for the books?
So, Freudian slip.
What's the
Stephen Pacey?
Yeah, Stephen Pacey, dude, he committed to that sex scene like 110%. He's doing all these grunts and moans. He's like switching from Logan's voice to Pharaoh's voice, and I'm just like, oh my God, this is awkward, but also incredibly hilarious. Both obviously what's happening, what Abercrombie wrote, and Pacey's commitment to the characters. You're like, oh my gosh, this is insane that I'm listening, that this is turned up in my headphones right now.
Yeah, the audiobook is something. So yeah,
don't listen to that with your parents around, I'll say that.
No, definitely not. It's it's a very you have to be realistic about these things sexy, and I think that there's a lot that's true to the characters too that happens in it. Say one thing for Joe Abercrombie, say he never loses track of building character,
Mhm.
and he has these moments where two really hardened fighters, Charles,
Mhm.
who are very comfortable in a battle, start having these more tender, intimate
Vulnerable moments,
moments.
yeah.
And those are way, way more uncomfortable and awkward for them.
Yeah.
And again, just how Abercrombie writes so true, but also so nuanced in
Yeah.
terms of
And it's so
the
funny because
characters.
all of Logan's fighting scenes, he's always like stumbling around, like high pitched
Mm,
wailing as he's tripping on stuff. He's very much kind of
yeah.
clumsy almost a lot of the times. And to see that translate into this like love scene is super funny. Say one thing for Logan Nine Fingers, say he's a lover.
Yes, that is a line in there. And it's after a moment that might not make you have that be the one thing you'd say for Logan, we'll say. So,
Yeah. He says it sarcastically
yes.
about himself.
Right. So we also get acquainted with two former lovers in, well, we're already acquainted with Baez, but you get what I'm saying. We get acquainted with
Mhm.
one of Baez's former lovers in Corneal when we get a lot more of the kind of backstory with Baez and what went on with him and Kalul and Canadius and Ptolemy. If you've read the books, you probably have a sense of what's going on with all that. But
Right.
yeah,
So Kwai is also has been kind of frustrated with Bias at this point too. There's that moment as well, and you start to get the sense with Baez that he's not telling the whole story, and he's telling
yeah,
everyone what they need to know to do what he wants them to do. Like we get that with Pharaoh constantly in this. He's like, "Hey, look, do you want to kill the Gurkish or not?" And he does eventually get coerced by the rest of the troop to kind of tell more of the story. And when we get into this castle, and I forget her name, the other Magi, she has quite
Corneal.
Conil. She has quite a different opinion of Baez than he has on himself. So very interesting, like just that other layer that carries in ominously into the next book of like what is all this background story with Canadius and the Master Maker and all this other stuff that seems to be looming over this book. Is it even important still? Like, because the seed was all a trick, all these things are questions that we have at the end of this arc.
In all, we know that Baez is seeking power. We know something went down where Baez claims he basically claims that he was taught by Juvens and alongside Kalul,
Mm-hmm.
and then the two of them kept fighting, so they had to be separated. And then Baez went to go get taught by Juven's brother Canadius, and he was taught by Canadius, that's a master maker who made the Shanka and made Logan's sword and things like that. And then Baez says he fell in love with the master maker's daughter Ptolemy
Mm-hmm.
and had to flee because Canadius was so pissed about it. They went back. Canadius then killed his own daughter in jealousy, and then Baez killed Canadius, and Baez and Kalul obviously not on good terms now. We know that whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
We also get this moment where when Glokta is torturing Schickel, the
Yes.
eater,
Mm-hmm.
where she calls Baez a liar and traitor. He killed his master. He murdered Juvens.
Mm.
And then Glokta says, that is not the way I heard the story. So we know that there's all sorts of versions of this story being told to all sorts of folks, and we just don't know which one is
That's
true.
right. I mean, it would make sense for
Well,
Gurkel
you and I
to
do.
yeah, I mean, we do, but it makes sense for Gurkel to believe that idea that Baez is a murderer because their leader is his name Kalul?
Yes, Kalul.
Kalul is the one leading them. So that's his narrative, obviously. And Baez
Right.
has the opposite narrative, and they're in Adjua, which Baez has a seat on the close council. So, like, everyone's telling the side of the story that puts them in the best light, and we have yet to discover the truth. And that's kind of the ominous. And does Baez even know? Because he was tricked. There's no seed, and he was genuinely kind of enraged by that. Like, he's like, "There's no seed. We were tricked," and so there's that whole piece of it. It was like, what is going on with all this stuff? And who knows what's true? It's impossible to seed it out at this point.
Seed it out.
I should have said, weed it out, I think is the right phrase.
Suss it out, but seed it out, it makes it's like you did it on purpose.
Yep.
So then we get an interesting perspective from Cornel, who is a former lover of Baez's, but also a former lover of Khalul's, and kind of is characterized by not getting involved in any of this, like almost characterized by sloth in some ways, and her lack of interest in seeking power in the ways that you can tell that Baez and Khalul both are. And she has a great line where she describes Baez and Khalul in reference to Juvens and Canadius, who came before them. She calls Baez and Khalul smaller men in a bigger world, but with no less hatred and no more mercy.
That's a great line.
And that is very true to some Abercrombie type characters, I think.
I think so as well. I think that's a great line that we're going to have to remember for when we read the last book in this trilogy, Last Argument of Kings. That's right.
Yeah. And I mean, Charles, is there anything that you wanted to cover that we didn't get the chance to?
I mean, we could probably talk about this Fellowship of the Seed stuff for a full hour, going into it. I mean, I loved when the Bloody Nine came back and defeated all of the Shanka. That was always fun. And, their relationship with Pharaoh I've always really liked, and I could talk for a long time about that. But I think we did it. We covered the whole book. It was quite ambitious, but I think we're good here. If you're happy, I'm happy.
Yeah, I'm feeling happy, Charles. I think that we're going to talk a lot more about Abercrombie as our podcast continues.
Yes.
This is far from the last you've heard about Abercrombie from us. We're going to buddy read all the way through the entire First Law world.
Yep.
We're going to keep producing other episodes. No matter how long this podcast goes, you can expect us to be talking about Abercrombie over here. So you don't have to worry if you're feeling that you want more. It's definitely coming. And Charles, honestly, you have me thinking it could be kind of fun to do an episode comparing the Fellowship of the Seed to the Fellowship of the Ring and see what comes up for us if we focus an episode on that in particular.
I think that's a great idea for an episode, and I would also love the opportunity to do a spoiler-full discussion of each character through the whole trilogy as well, because you could really deep dive into each character and how they were written and easily fill content. So you could... and then remove this veil of trying not to give out spoilers, right? And then you can talk about anything, and I think that would be a lot of fun to do that as well for all you First Law fans out there.
Right. I mean, we can do almost even just like a Logan Nine Fingers character profile that's its own episode and release that and so on for all the characters like you're talking about there, Charles. Maybe I'll try to draw a little from my psych background if we do something like that.
I think that'd be interesting.
Right.
Absolutely. But for now, I think we're good on Before They Are Hanged, Book 2 by Joe Abercrombie. You ready for this outro?
Yeah, throw that outro on.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. If you like what you heard today, if you're excited for more Joe Abercrombie or just more fantasy discussions in general, then let us know. Reach out to us on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at the FTF Podcast. You can always send us an email. That's an option you will always have, and you can send it to us over at the FTF Podcast at gmail.com. Now, if you really like the show and you want to show your support, Dylan, what kind of options do they have before them if there's on, say, I don't know, Apple Podcasts?
If you're on Apple Podcasts, you can toss 5 stars to our podcast.
Yes.
Just scroll down on that Friends Talking Fantasy podcast page on Apple Podcast app, that is, and find the spot with the stars. Click 5 of them, ideally. Write a review if you do have time, but we know you're busy, and just the fact that you spent this time listening to our episode and made it to the end, that's more than enough. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you, Joe, for writing such an incredible series. You all are great. We love you all. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.